Okay, Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind. We'll take a quick look at Rupert Spira, specifically on time and his notion of panpsychism. Sort of be hitting the notion there is no time, and what is a very limited view of the panpsychic and a limited view of the problems in general. There's quite a number of spiritually enlightened folks doing philosophical, even physics discussion on the basis of their spiritual experience. One need only witness the parade of folks on the Conscious TV channel or Buddha at the gas pump. You get the idea. And it's fine. It doesn't mean the philosophy is particularly commendable. This discussion with Rupert Spira caught my eye, The Nature of Consciousness and Time, 2021. Rupert has written several books. Transparency of Things, Being Aware of Being Aware, The Light of Pure Knowing, The Nature of Consciousness, and others. He's like ubiquitous on YouTube. I want to look at his discussion in the video above, The Nature of Consciousness and Time, on time and also panpsychism, as I warned. So Rupert begins his discussion on time with a familiar, in this genre particularly, theme, there is only now. To quote, "We can't make sense of time without in some way referring to the past or the future. In actual experience, have you ever left what we call now and visited that place that we call the past? Not that we have thought about it. We can all think about it, but thought doesn't take place in the past. It takes place now. But have we ever actually experienced the place we refer to as the past? Could anyone experience it?" The interviewer says no, because if they had an experience of it, it would take place now. Experience by definition takes place now. Otherwise, no one has ever had an experience of the future. Okay, and now if none of the billions that have existed, if nobody has ever experienced the past or the future, could it be that our model of time is simply that, a model, which is necessary for everyday life, but a model that doesn't actually portray the nature of reality? Because surely in order to build a model of reality, we must start with our experience. Continuing, either we start with our experience or we start with an abstract model. But then we could start with any model at all. So if our models are going to be grounded in reality, they must start with something that is verifiable in experience, and nobody has ever experienced the past or the future. Okay, and we experience what we call now. Is it your experience that now is a fleeting moment, or is your experience that now is ever present? The interviewer says, well, it seems most inextricably connected to awareness itself. Exactly. If I were to ask you how many moments now have you experienced since we have been talking to each other, if I were to ask that, the interviewer says, well, it's like infinite. No, it's not infinite moments. It's just one. It's just one experience. The now is only one experience. You haven't experienced infinite moments. You only experience infinite moments if you believe that the now is a fraction of a second. And if our experience was indeed of a fraction of a second, then indeed we'd have experienced millions of them. But we are not experiencing millions of fractions of seconds. It's always just now. Continuing, and given that you've admitted I've never experienced the past or the future, can you really say it is your experience that now is moving along a line of time? Or is the now stationary? It would seem it's more of a stationary position, says the interviewer. It's stationary because we have no experience of a line of time between the past and the future, through which the now could be moving. The experience of now is stationary, it's stable, and it's awareness as you've wisely observed. The now is the presence of awareness. It's not going anywhere. Okay? And if it hasn't come from somewhere, it's eternal. And by eternal, I mean ever-present, not everlasting. It's in a vertical dimension, not a horizontal dimension. However, when we think about that vertical dimension, that eternal now, thought refracts it and spreads out the eternal and makes it seem like the everlasting. So he's sort of visualizing the events going along, and there's the awareness of now. And thought comes along and spreads it out as though there was a past, future. Finally, so I would suggest that time is what consciousness looks like when it is refracted through thought. And I would suggest that space is what consciousness looks like when refracted through sense perception. Time and space are not fundamental to reality, he says. The reality is dimensionless consciousness. It only appears as time and space when refracted through the prismatic activity of thinking and perceiving. So Rupert, we've seen, insists this is faithful to experience. I'd say on the contrary. In his way, he's rejecting experience. Our experience is a flow. We see the coffee swirling. There's continuous motion. Yes, there's a sliding window, so to speak. Only a limited time extent is specified, a function of the brain's dynamics and a specification of a scale of time. For example, remember we have our buzzing fly, a normal scale of time, one possible scale. Could have a heron-like fly, smaller scale of time, but we've got this scale. But that now is filled with flow, change, and motion at a particular scale. So yes, there's always this present, as he says, but it's not like there's no time. But for Rupert, that window almost seems to collapse into an instantaneous vertical line. Not quite instantaneous, but somehow that motion is lost, and that indivisible transformation, as we'll see, is lost in this discussion. In other words, in contemplating that experience, what Rupert saw and what Bergson saw are two different things. Bergson saw a time where each instant flows into, interpenetrates, merges with the next, like the notes of a melody. To quote, might it not be said that even if these notes exceed one another, yet we perceive them in one another, and that the totality may be compared to a living being whose parts, although distinct, permeate one another, just because they are so closely connected. We can conceive then of succession without distinction, and think of it as a mutual penetration, an interconnection and organization of elements, each one of which represents the whole, and cannot be distinguished or isolated from it except by abstract thought. Such is the account of duration that would be given by a being who was ever the same and ever changing, and who had no idea of abstract space from time and free will. So going back to that comment, a being who was ever the same and ever changing, and who had no idea of abstract space. Now, the abstract space is the 4D space of the classic metaphysic, the three-dimensional, infinitely divisible continuum of points, positions. Our cup moves across that continuum of points, positions, and is treated as a series of points along a trajectory, a straight line. Each of those points becomes an instant of time. And since that's a line is infinitely divisible, between each pair of points, there's another line, itself another infinity of points, lines between each of those points, etc., and infinite regress. Each position is known as an instant, and therefore we can visualize the universe at each instant as a cube of space, that is all of the universe, space after space after space. Each of these cubes has the time extent of a mathematical point. At the end of the infinite division is a mathematical point. Each of those instants becomes a mathematical point, and therefore what you have is a 4D structure of instantaneous, utterly homogeneous cubes of space, because at a mathematical instant there can be no quality. So this is a conceptual construction, an artifact of thought. It is this abstract time that Rupert is seeing as the effect of thought, and calling it time, a series of instants. And the now just becomes one of these instants, albeit he gives it some thickness. It appears always present instant. But he's really always coming back to this classic metaphysic as being that which describes time, while he simultaneously ignores the basic, continuous, indivisible flow of experience. The difference here is illustrated wonderfully, I think, in this quote from Bergson. Suppose that my speech had been lasting for years, since the first awakening of my consciousness, that it had been carried on in one single sentence, and my consciousness able to employ itself entirely in embracing the total meaning of the sentence. Then I should no more seek the explanation of the integral preservation of this entire past than I seek the explanation of the preservation of the three first syllables of the word conversation when I pronounce the last syllable. Well, I believe that our whole psychical existence is something just like this single sentence, continued since the awakening of consciousness, interspersed with commas, but never broken by full stops. The point is this: whether speech or the coffee stirring, whether sentence, perception or coffee stirring embedded within eating breakfast, or eating breakfast embedded within the life experience of farming. Remove this window, the window that specifies the time extent of our perception, and our entire life experience becomes one long, indivisible flow. So let's look at panpsychism, Rupert's view. To quote again, panpsychism is another idea that is very fashionable in philosophy of mind circles now, which is the idea that the universe is made up of subatomic particles, whatever exactly they may be, and that each of these particles is conscious. This again is very different from the non-dual understanding that suggests that only consciousness is conscious. The idea of panpsychism is an extension of the primary mistake of materialism, namely that what we essentially are is a physical body, and that as a physical body we have an attribute of consciousness. And in other words, this body is conscious or has consciousness. Now, if we take that as the basic fact of our experience, we then can reason that, okay, dogs and cats also have consciousness. And that's corroborated by the fact that when you tread on your cat's tail, it screeches. Why? Because it is conscious of pain. Now that makes sense. And we do the same experiment with birds and fishes, even fleas and ants. They seem to have consciousness. They respond to their environment. So they must have a degree of consciousness. Continuing, reasoning in this way, we go on and on and on until we end up with the idea that, well, everything has a degree of consciousness. Not just humans and dogs and cats and birds and ants, but everything. Even subatomic particles have a modicum of consciousness. And this idea of panpsychism is based on this idea that I, this body, has consciousness, or is consciousness. That's the primary belief that defines materialism. So something is wrong here. Let's start with this. The quote, "And matter is what the activity of consciousness looks like from a localized perspective." This is highly coordinated with the statement we already saw. Space is what consciousness looks like when refracted through sense perception. So that's the question. Remove our perception, the activity of consciousness localized. Is there a physical world? I suspect for Rupert, no. A consciousness, perhaps, everywhere, in some form, that is, some strange spatial form, everywhere, but planets, trees, electrons, no. In Bergson's framework, the brain is specifying sources in the holographic field at a scale of time. The brain is a reconstructive wave with its inherent biochemical dynamics, specifying that scale. Normally, a buzzing fly, 200 beats per second to the wings, but could be a heron-like fly, barely flapping his wings, or it could be a whirling ensemble of electrons. That's what it would look like, as we've said. But remove the brain and its specification, this process. The field is still there, but at the most minute scale of time imaginable, what I call the null scale. But yet, it is an objective field with planets, trees, in some form at say the null scale. They're not going to exactly look like trees or planets. We'll call them some sort of waveforms, but they're there. But it is a field with an elementary awareness defined throughout the field at the null scale of time. This is due to the field's holographic property, for the state of each point reflects the state of every other point. That is, each point is aware of the whole, so to speak, an elementary form of awareness defined throughout the field. There's also its indivisible motion. It's not instant to instant, where each instant falls into the past for the non-existence as it becomes the previous instant. So the field has a primary memory, which allows the past extent, the buzzing fly, the heron-like fly, to be specified. So in this case, perception is always already a memory. It's a specification of a past extent of the indivisibly transforming field, where there are no discrete instants falling into the past. So the specification is to a time-scaled form then of this elementary awareness, a buzzing fly, a heron-like fly. This allows us to remove the homunculus, the little man inside the head watching the fly, or in the holographic reconstruction framework, the viewer looking at the source. The source is directly specified. So this is a unique form of panpsychism, beyond Rupert's conception of what panpsychism is all about. So expanding on this sentence, the specification is to a time-scaled form of this elementary awareness, the fly being a time-scaled form of the field at a scale of time. This is undergirded by the framework in creative evolution. The vision is this, as we discussed in 49. It is consciousness, the inextensive, that pushes, so to speak, the universe into existence, the birds, the butterflies, the brontosaurs, and is the force behind the continuous becoming of the universe, the continuous creation of the now. This push is an intensive force. The relaxation, or the lessening of this force, is the emergence of the extensive, the material world, with its geometric tendencies. So it's the emergence of the matter, extended, and its tendency to the geometric or mathematical order. That is, this abstract space, the 4D continuum of points / instants, underlying the classic metaphysic and all math. And it's an ideal limit. This mathematical order and this physical law is a tendency, an ideal limit never fully realized. It's never concretely reached. To quote from Creative Evolution, for if matter is the relaxation of the inextensive into the extensive, and thereby of liberty into necessity, necessity being the supposed determinism of physical law, it does not indeed wholly coincide with pure homogeneous, this abstract space. Yet it is constituted by the movement that leads to space, and therefore is on the way to geometry. But again, it's just on the way. It's an ideal limit. It never truly gets there. This is the difficulty with the abstract, and reifying the abstract into reality as an AI. So matter is consciousness, weakened, so to speak, diminished, but it exists without the need for a localized perspective. So when Rupert says the primary mistake of materialism, namely that what we essentially are is a physical body, and that we as a physical body have an attribute of consciousness, in other words, that this body is consciousness or has consciousness, but But the body must have an attribute of consciousness. Our body is intrinsically embedded in the indivisibly transforming holographic field, which Bergson also, in developing this notion of the holographic field, called the sea of real action. Just think waves traveling everywhere throughout this field. Waves ultimately a giant interference pattern. To quote him, any given object acts upon all other objects in the field, is in turn acted upon by all other objects. It is in fact obliged to, quote, transmit the whole of what it receives, to oppose every action with an equal and contrary reaction, to be, in short, merely the road by which pass in every direction the modifications of what can be termed real actions propagated throughout the immensity of the entire universe. So the sea of real actions. The image of the coffee cup or the fly is virtual action. Succinctly, perception is virtual action. The brain is selecting as a reconstructive wave a subset of the real actions, that subset in which the body can act. A coffee cup, a fly. We are seeing how we can act relative to the specified scale of time. That is, a buzzing fly versus a fly merely flapping his wings. There is an affective component in viewing the coffee, however. You have the very qualia field image of the external world, because the holographic field is qualitative in the first place, being specified at a scale of time. That's already qualia. But you have the feeling involved. Yum, it's hot coffee. And the sting of the wasp. Now that affect, pain, feeling, is the function of the body as embedded in the sea of real action. The body itself is equally embedded in this sea. These are melodically, indivisibly transforming, not instant after instant, as noted. This is the basis of the body's affect. So that surface there of the skin is the dividing line between the virtual and the real action flowing throughout the body. We treated this much more in detail in number 59 on souls and feelings. So the origin of affect is a complement to the origin of the image of the external world. These are two halves of the hard problem of what it is like. But Rupert, so far as I can see, is not particularly concerned with the hard problem. So my last comments. There is no time, which is kind of where you get led to it with Rupert. It's kind of an ubiquitous statement in New Age or spiritual community philosophy. We've seen the special relativity exemplar of this, the block time, and its total absurdity. Now, Rupert seems maybe not exactly this, but he's just so close. The hard problem, the origin of the image of the external world, his theory, his model, well, it's only his form of idealism that's his theory. But we've been through the problems of idealism. Kastrup, Hoffman, Backlund, Goff's panpsychic version, Thomas Campbell. But this is a privileged problem, the origin of the external world, if your subject is consciousness. It cannot be ignored, and particularly not as thoroughly as by Rupert. In my humble opinion, and yes, obviously biased opinion, Rupert is not even close to Bergson in depth, width, scope, insight, grasp of the problems. Looking at Rupert, I see nothing science can use. In Bergson is a framework for perception, cognition, memory. In truth, an alternative to the computer model of mind, a concrete alternative. One would think that if you're offering a philosophy of consciousness, which Rupert is, that it would embrace both science and spirituality. We want such a philosophy. Bergson's framework, there's mystical, that is non-dual implications that Rupert could mine for years. Just from a spiritual view, this is the guy, Bergson, who inspired Teilhard de Chardin, yet zero interest. I continue to be shocked at this phenomenon. Is it from arrogance, information suppression, complete lack of intuition? Why is there this plethora of philosophical theorists who feel it seems completely sufficient unto themselves. Who had any intuition would sense someone with a truly profound mind? I don't get it. So, in any case, next time we'll see. Till then, signing off.